The microphone felt heavier than it should have as I stood before 200 of my mother's closest friends and colleagues. She sat at the head table, radiant in her navy blue dress, completely unaware that her perfectly orchestrated retirement party was about to become the stage for 30 years of hidden truths. I cleared my throat and smiled. Not the warm smile of a loving daughter celebrating her mother's achievements. No, this was different. This was the smile of someone who had finally found the missing pieces of their life tucked away in a dusty attic box marked Tax Documents 1994. My name is Rachel Chen, and until 3 weeks ago, I thought I knew who I was. Successful marketing director, devoted daughter, the pride of my mother's life. But isn't it funny how a single discovery can rewrite your entire history? The room hushed as I began to speak. My mother's expression shifted from proud anticipation to something else. Was that fear flickering in her eyes? Good. She should be afraid. Let me take you back to where this all started. 3 weeks earlier, I'd been helping my mother clear out the attic of our family home. She was downsizing, moving to a lovely condo downtown after retirement. I'd taken a week off work to help her sort through decades of accumulated memories. The attic was exactly what you'd expect. Dusty boxes, old furniture, Christmas decorations from the 80s. My mother directed operations from the bottom of the ladder, her voice carrying up through the floorboards. Sort this, toss that, donate those. She had it all figured out. Until I found the box. It was shoved far back under the eaves, behind a tower of my old college textbooks. Tax Documents 1994 read the faded label in my mother's precise handwriting, but something felt off. The tape sealing it was newer, yellower than it should have been for a box supposedly untouched since the 90s. My hands trembled slightly as I peeled back the tape. Inside, nestled between old receipts and faded forms, was a manila envelope. No label. But the weight of it. The weight told me this was something more than tax returns. 27 letters, each one addressed to me, each one unopened, each one postmarked over the years of my childhood and teenage life. The return addresses made my heart stop. Some from my father, the man my mother told me had abandoned us when I was 3, who never wanted anything to do with us. Others from my paternal grandparents, who I'd been told died in a car accident when I was 5. A few from addresses I didn't recognize. I sat there in that stuffy attic, sweat dripping down my back, reading letter after letter. My father hadn't abandoned us. He'd fought for custody. He'd sent birthday cards, Christmas gifts, pleaded for just a phone call. My grandparents hadn't died. They'd tried to maintain contact, sent money for my education, begged my mother to let them see me. The most recent letter was from 10 years ago. My father's handwriting had grown shaky. I'm sick, Rachel. The doctors say I don't have long. I just want to see my daughter one more time. Please. I must have made a sound because my mother called up, asking if I was all right. All right? I felt like I was drowning in that airless attic, surrounded by the evidence of a life stolen from me. Somehow, I managed to answer her. Told her I'd found some old photos, needed a moment to look through them. Then I carefully photographed each letter with my phone, returned them to their envelope, and sealed the box exactly as I'd found it. The next 2 weeks were torture. I went through the motions of helping my mother pack, smiled at her stories, laughed at her jokes. All while those letters burned in my mind. I hired a private investigator with money from my savings. Within days, I had answers that shattered what was left of my carefully constructed world. My father had died 3 years ago, alone. The obituary mentioned his lifelong hope of reuniting with his daughter. My grandparents were still alive, living 2 states away. The investigator showed me recent photos. They kept a shrine of newspaper clippings about me. Every academic achievement, Every professional milestone my mother had proudly shared with her friends had somehow made its way to them. They'd followed my life from afar, forbidden from making contact by the restraining order my mother had filed based on false allegations of harassment. There were 2 half-siblings I'd never known existed. My father had remarried, had other children, but according to the investigators' research, he'd never stopped trying to find me. He'd saved money in a trust fund for my education, money my mother had returned, claiming I wanted nothing from him. The betrayal cut so deep, I couldn't breathe sometimes. Every happy memory of my childhood was now tainted with the knowledge of what had been kept from me. Every time my mother had comforted me about not having a father, every lie about him not caring, every fabricated story about my grandparents' death, it all played on repeat in my mind. But I didn't confront her, not yet, because I'd learned something about my mother in those 2 weeks of pretending everything was normal. She was a master manipulator. Every conversation we'd ever had, I now saw with fresh eyes. The way she'd isolated me from forming close friendships, always finding fault with anyone who got too close. The way she'd inserted herself into every aspect of my life, making herself indispensable. The way she'd crafted a narrative where she was the hero, the sacrificing single mother who gave up everything for her ungrateful daughter. No, a private confrontation wouldn't do. She'd find a way to twist it, to make herself the victim. She'd cry, she'd manipulate, she'd find some way to make me doubt what I'd seen with my own eyes. So I planned. Her retirement party had been in the works for months. The company where she'd worked for 35 years as head of human resources was pulling out all the stops. 200 guests, catered dinner, speeches from colleagues and friends, and one speech from her loving daughter. I'd volunteered to organize the slideshow, collecting photos from her life. It gave me the perfect excuse to dig deeper, to piece together the full story. I found court documents she'd hidden, falsified reports to child services, letters from lawyers, the meticulous paper trail of a woman who'd systemically erased half my family from existence. The night before the party, I couldn't sleep. I'd written and rewritten my speech a dozen times. Part of me wanted to back out, to just walk away and never speak to her again. But that would let her off too easy. She'd spin some story about her ungrateful daughter, play the victim to her friends and colleagues. No, she deserved to have her carefully constructed image shattered, just as she'd shattered my life. Which brings us back to the retirement party. The microphone in my hand, the expectant faces, my mother's growing unease as I pulled out not the single page of notes she'd seen me practicing with, but a thick stack of papers. I began with the standard pleasantries, thanked everyone for coming, made a few jokes about my mother's legendary organizational skills. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly. Maybe she thought I wouldn't go through with it. Then I said the words that changed everything. My mother taught me the importance of truth and transparency. So tonight, I want to share some truths with all of you. I pulled out the first letter. My hands were steady now, my voice clear. I read my father's words aloud, his joy at my birth, his desperation as my mother cut off contact, his pleading to just know if I was okay. I watched the color drain from my mother's face as recognition dawned. The room was silent except for my voice. I read letter after letter. Birthday wishes never received. Christmas cards never delivered. My grandmother's shaky handwriting asking if I still liked butterflies, if I'd gotten the birthday money she'd sent, if I knew how much they loved me. Some guests shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned forward, caught up in the unfolding drama. A few of my mother's closer friends shot glances at her, perhaps remembering stories she'd told about my deadbeat father and his toxic family. When I finished with the letters, I moved on to the legal documents, the falsified restraining orders, the returned education fund, the systematic campaign to erase my father and his family from my life. I kept my voice level, professional, just presenting facts. My mother tried to stand once, but her legs wouldn't hold her. The colleague sitting next to her, a woman who'd known her for 20 years, physically recoiled from her. I concluded with the obituary. My father's obituary, which mentioned his greatest regret, was never reconciling with his daughter. I explained how I'd found out he'd died 3 years ago, alone, still hoping. The silence when I finished was deafening. Then I looked directly at my mother and spoke the words I'd rehearsed 100 times. You stole my father from me. You stole my grandparents, my siblings, my entire family. You built your reputation as a devoted single mother on a foundation of lies. Everyone in this room has heard you tell stories about your sacrifice, about how hard it was raising me alone. But you weren't alone by circumstance. You were alone by choice. My choice was taken from me. Someone in the back of the room started crying. My mother's boss, a man who'd praised her integrity in his speech earlier, looked like he'd been punched. The HR director who'd worked under my mother for a decade had her hand over her mouth in shock. But I wasn't done. I'd saved the worst for last. 3 weeks ago, when I found these letters, I also found something else. Evidence that this wasn't the only family you've destroyed. How many custody battles did you influence in your role as head of HR? How many fathers did you advise to just walk away because the mother knew best? How many workplace complaints did you bury? How many lives did you manipulate? The accusation hung heavy in the air. I saw several of her colleagues exchange looks, perhaps remembering cases that had never quite added up, decisions that had seemed oddly biased. My mother finally found her voice. It came out as a whisper, but in the silent room, everyone heard her. Rachel, please. I did it for you. I protected you. I laughed. Actually laughed. The sound was harsh, bitter, nothing like the laugh of the daughter she'd raised. Protected me? From what? From a father who loved me? From grandparents who kept every newspaper clipping about my achievements? From siblings who could have been my best friends? You protected me from love, from family, from truth. You protected yourself and your image, nothing more. I set down the microphone and gathered my papers. The walk to the exit felt like miles, every eye in the room on me. As I reached the door, I turned back one last time. My mother sat frozen at her table, tears streaming down her face. But they weren't tears of remorse. I knew her too well for that. They were tears of self-pity, of narcissistic injury. Her perfect image, cultivated over decades, had shattered in minutes. I'm going to find my family now, I announced to the room. What's left of them? My grandparents are still alive, waiting 2 states away. I have siblings who don't even know I exist. I have aunts, uncles, cousins, an entire family tree that was hidden from me. If any of you have been affected by her manipulations in your own custody battles or family situations, I encourage you to look deeper. The truth has a way of surfacing, even after 30 years. I left them with that. The last thing I heard as the door closed behind me was the scrape of chairs as people began to leave, and my mother's voice, high and desperate, trying to explain, to justify, to manipulate one more time. The parking lot air felt clean in my lungs. For the first time in my life, I felt truly free. Free from the web of lies. Free from the suffocating control disguised as love. Free to discover who I really was beyond the narrative she'd created. My phone buzzed with a text from the private investigator. He'd made contact with my grandparents, explained the situation. They were waiting by their phone, hoping beyond hope that their granddaughter might finally call. I sat in my car for a long moment, staring at their number on my screen. 30 years of lost time stretched between us, but it wasn't too late. My father was gone, that chance stolen forever, but my grandparents were waiting. My siblings existed somewhere out there, possibly wondering about the sister they'd heard whispers of. As I drove away from the hotel, I thought about the wreckage I'd left behind. My mother's career would likely not survive this. Her friendships, built on a foundation of lies, would crumble. The legal implications of what she'd done, both personally and professionally, would catch up with her. Did I feel guilty? Perhaps a small part of me did. The part that still remembered bedtime stories and birthday cakes, the mother who'd attended every school play and choir concert. But that mother was a character in a performance, a role played to perfection. The real woman was someone who'd systematically destroyed my relationship with half my family to maintain control. The next morning, I called my grandparents. My grandmother answered on the first ring, as if she'd been sitting by the phone. When she heard my voice, she broke down completely. Through her tears, she managed to tell me they'd never stopped hoping, never stopped loving me. My grandfather got on the line, his voice gruff with emotion, telling me about the bedroom they'd kept ready for me all these years, just in case. We made plans to meet that weekend. They promised to bring photo albums, to share all the stories I'd missed. They told me about my half-siblings, a brother named Marcus, who was an engineer, a sister named Diana, who taught elementary school. Both had grown up knowing about me, their missing older sister. Both wanted to meet me. The drive to my grandparents' house was the longest and shortest of my life. Every mile took me further from the life I'd known, and closer to the one that had been stolen. When I pulled into their driveway, they were already outside waiting. My grandmother was smaller than I'd expected, white-haired and fragile-looking, but her hug was fierce, desperate, 30 years of love compressed into that first embrace. My grandfather stood back at first, tears streaming down his weathered face. When he finally hugged me, he whispered that I looked just like my father at that age. It broke something inside me, and I cried like I hadn't cried since I was a child. We spent the weekend sharing stories, looking through photos, filling in the blank spaces of my history. They showed me pictures of my father throughout the years, his second wedding, where he'd left an empty chair for me, birthday parties where he'd buy 2 cakes, one to celebrate with and one he'd eat alone, making a wish for his missing daughter, the illness that took him, how he'd kept my baby pictures by his hospital bed until the end. My siblings came for Sunday dinner. The moment Diana walked in, I saw our father in her eyes. Marcus had his smile. They were nervous at first, unsure how to bridge the gap of 30 years. But blood tells, and by the end of the evening, it felt like we'd always known each other. They shared stories of growing up with a father who never stopped mourning his first child, who taught them to leave a place at the table for their missing sister. It's been 6 months now since the retirement party. My mother has tried to contact me countless times. Letters, emails, messages through mutual acquaintances. I haven't responded to any of them. Her former colleagues have reached out too. Some to apologize for not seeing through her facade. Others to share their own stories of how her advice had affected their lives. The legal ramifications are still unfolding. Several fathers have come forward, claiming she influenced their custody battles. The company launched an investigation into her years of HR decisions. I've been told criminal charges might be filed for the falsified documents and restraining orders, but I try not to focus on that. Instead, I focus on rebuilding, on learning my grandmother's recipes and hearing my grandfather's stories, on getting to know my siblings and building the relationships we should have had all along, on visiting my father's grave and telling him all the things I never got to say. The truth didn't set me free, it shattered me first. But from those pieces, I'm building something new, something honest, something real. I carry the weight of 30 lost years, but also the hope of whatever time remains. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that retirement party, about the moment when I stood at that microphone and chose truth over comfort, justice over family loyalty. Would I do it again? Every single time. Because some betrayals are too deep for private confrontation. Some lies are too big to let fade quietly into the past. My mother stole 30 years from me, from all of us. She built her life on the graves of relationships she murdered with lies. The least I could do was make sure everyone knew exactly who they'd been celebrating that night. The last I heard, she'd moved away, started over in a city where no one knew her story. But the internet is forever, and the truth has a way of following us wherever we go. She'll spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder, wondering when her past will catch up again. As for me, I'm learning what it means to be part of a real family. One built on truth, not manipulation. On love, not control. It's messy and complicated and sometimes painful as we navigate the scars of lost time. But it's real. And after 30 years of perfectly crafted lies, real is all I want.